Well, good evening and welcome. Thank you for your patience. It's fantastic to see such an enormous and interested group here this evening. I'm Merit Jano, Dean of SEPA, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you here this evening. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on how technology can enrich urban policy. A subject really that's very timely engaging here in New York City, and one that we are exploring very deeply at SEPA along a number of different lines. A few years ago, when I became Dean of SEPA, I thought it would be important for us to launch a technology and public policy initiative that would engage how data and digital technologies were transforming our core fields, whether it was national security or urban policy. And we launched a Dean's Challenge grant. We invested in a startup lab downtown. We tried to support our student entrepreneurial initiatives around our core fields in every way that we can. And last year, we were very appreciative of receiving a further support from the NASDAQ Educational Foundation in support of an initiative around entrepreneurship and digital technologies and public policies more broadly. Tonight, we are grateful to be undertaking this discussion also in collaboration with Sidewalk Labs in sponsoring tonight's event. And we do appreciate the innovative thinking that it's applying to urban challenges across a variety of areas. And we have a remarkable group of experts and leaders who are very active in this space, whether as policymakers, entrepreneurs, or business leaders. And let me just briefly welcome them here tonight. Rohit Agarwal is the Chief Policy Advisor of Sidewalk Labs, but of course he's also a professor at SEPA, and so we're very grateful. And he's a historian by training, but increasingly noted as a technology futurist around cities. So welcome back in this capacity. We have also Noel Francoise, who's CEO of HeatSeek, Miguel Gamino, who's Chief Technology Officer of the City of New York, welcome. Maria Gotch, President and CEO of the Partnership Fund for New York City, a very important organization for New York City. And Andrew Rousset, who's founder and CEO of Civic Hall, I think an extraordinary innovation of a few years ago that is really bringing the technology and public policy community together in interesting ways, and I'm sure you'll speak to that. The purpose of our initiative around entrepreneurship and public policy is to examine the conditions that give rise to entrepreneurship and the relationship between public policies and entrepreneurship, as well as some vertical areas where we're seeing extraordinary entrepreneurship occur, including in New York City. So I would say that it is both a horizontal initiative as well as a vertical initiative. And we have faculty across Columbia University who are thinking and creating ventures and doing research around these themes, and SEPA is honored to be a hub of engagement and scholarship around those subjects. We're also continuing with our Dean's Policy Challenge, which has been focusing on urban policy, and this year urban policy and the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So thank you all for joining us. Without further delay, let me invite Andrew to lead this discussion. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Let me just ask the audience questions. Did anybody arrive here via a shared car service, an Uber or a Juno or a Lyft? Okay, one hand. Did anybody arrive by a driverless car? Or by drone? And how many of you have read the terms of service of this event before you signed and replied to the RSVP? Because we have now captured all of your data, and we're going to use it. The arena of technology and urban policy is a very, very broad one, and we're delighted to be here, particularly with this organization, which Merit has been leading, because Merit has been leading a conversation about not just public policy in general, but how technology itself is affecting how public policy is formed and how it's facing new challenges and new opportunities. To give you a sense of the broad scope of this topic, let me describe three, potentially four areas that you might want to consider. So, and by definition. So, civic tech, we like to define at Civic Hall as any technology that's designed to support the public good. I can give you an example of that, such as Crisis Text Line, which uses technology to allow teenagers to text from across the United States when they're in trouble of some sort. Then there's GovTech, which is any technology that the government may use to deliver the services that it is supposed to deliver to the public, and very often it's supposed to be for the public good, but not necessarily. An example where that may not be the case is that a technology that allows the police department to check the social media profiles of African Americans before they pull them over at the side of the road and check to see if they tweeted about Black Lives Matter. I wouldn't exactly call that civic tech. Or then there's urban tech or smart city tech, some people would like to describe, which covers a very wide area, such as Internet of Things, and of course transportation, efficiency of buildings, the way cities work, how people interact with each other. And those three that I just described are also sort of encompassed around what some people call regulation tech, which is technology that might make it easier to regulate or to understand how to build systems for all of these intertwined technologies. And although many of these technologies overlap, there are real important reasons that they should be understood and sometimes separated, because the intentionality of the technology has a lot to do with its result. For example, it's a tool like a hammer. It can build a house, and it could also do a lot of damage if it's not used properly or if it's used in a nefarious way. And we're going to have this conversation at the same time that we're aware of the fact that technology is moving very, very fast, faster than most public policymakers can keep up with it. We can barely keep up with it ourselves. And I can't believe I'm still using this line from 20 years ago, but unfortunately most politicians still don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. But on the other hand, technologists don't often know the difference between a bill and a check. And so there's a big disconnect. So what we're hoping to do today is to illuminate some of these topics for you by the experts that Merit just introduced, and have a conversation about some of the ins and outs, the opportunities and the challenges. And we'll do that for about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll try to open it up to all of you for your own comments and questions. We'll try to make it lively and not take ourselves too seriously. So I've asked each of our panelists to, based on the framing that I just gave, to introduce themselves in the way they view the landscape and also their role in it. And then we'll get into some specific questions and we'll see if we can get into some details. So with that, I'm going to just start at the end of the row here and start with Miguel, who recently was convinced to leave San Francisco and join the most diverse and empathetic technology community in New York, in the United States, here in New York, the Chief Technology Officer of the City of New York. Miguel.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I left the greatest city on the West Coast for the greatest city. Although coming up the stairs, I thought I was back in San Francisco, coming through the park. So the hill surprised me. So I appreciate the framing and appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation here today about something that I was focused on when I was in San Francisco, and I've been recruited here to New York to focus on this same thing for New York. And I think it's about the convergence of the different segments that Andrew articulated. I think it's fairly clear to me, at least, that government has a role in each of those things, although that role may differ. kind of the top line thing I think that I'm trying to advocate very strongly for, even evangelize, is that our role across all those segments is to be concerned with the impact to the public experience. That all of these things, even the GovTech example that Andrew described, even GovTech needs to be ultimately for the benefit of the public, because that's our customer. That's not always. I think there's a lot of governments now. It's become a little kind of in vogue to talk about the public or the constituency as our customers, but not all municipal governments are really acting that way. And I think they're trying, but that's a fairly significant paradigm shift to begin thinking about it that way. But it's really important as a baseline to all of these different segments. I think as we're approaching smart cities or urban tech, I believe that there's a strong overlap with civic tech, driven by an engagement with that community sector that Andrew described in New York in particular is very socially engaged. And so I think we need to make sure that we figure out how to weave these things together to, at the end of the day, be able to point to how we've made the public experience, that end-to-end interaction with government, knowingly or unknowingly, measurably better. I use kind of personas to describe that in my team, and as we're starting to talk about it with other departments in the city organization and external stakeholders and contributors. And we describe it in the way a typical New Yorker might experience it. And as we go through that description of a person who's trying to navigate streets or public transportation and different ways that we can enable data or systems to make that experience significantly better, and have other pieces of infrastructure as they make that pathway home more aware of their ultimate objective, which is to get home safely, conveniently, and all those sorts of things. I think we want to make sure that at the end of the day we can measure that impact and really be able to point to how we've moved that needle. When I describe that, then the security and the privacy concerns come up, which I know we're going to talk about today, and I think are really, really important. One thing I'll just say in the context of government's role in that discussion is I think privacy concerns are different when you're talking about the government, because the government has the ability to deny you your money and your liberty. And that's different than Facebook and other big organizations that do have access to a lot and have a lot of privacy concerns. But the government's position in that conversation is different, and we need to understand that, recognize that, and figure out how to make that work for people. So those are the different angles that we're thinking about, making sure that technology, at the end of the day, ultimately benefits our end user and our customer.
Well,
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
yep.
Great. I'm Noelle. I'm the executive director of HeatSeek. And I think first and foremost, we think of ourselves as a civic tech organization. Our organization builds technology for a very particular public good. We operate at sort of the intersection of civic tech and housing justice. So we sit both in the civic tech side of things and very much so in the nonprofit service provider side of things. We also interface with GovTech. We interface with HPD, which is the city agency that enforces the housing code. We're constantly thinking about how we can make our product and our tool more user-friendly to them so that they can use the data that we're providing to make better, smarter, faster decisions about how they handle housing inspections. I don't know, I didn't actually get a chance to see my bio. I assume it says what we do, right? Okay. We build temperature sensors and a data tool so you can view the temperature in your apartment. You can also view exactly when your apartment is not being heated at the legal limit as per the New York City housing code. So you can see hour by hour, is my building in violation? Then you can print out that heat log and take it with you to housing court. So we also operate in like a legal sense. We're not lawyers, but we work very closely with lawyers and community organizers who are doing a lot of the boots on the ground work with the tenants that we serve. And so we think very deeply about how we can build a product that will best serve their needs. We're also an IoT product. Our temperature sensors are connected to the web. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can better and less expensively send our data. So we kind of, I think, hit on most all of them.
Rick?
Thanks. So first of all, we're very honored at Sidewalk Labs to be working with SEPA, just like I've always been excited to be teaching at SEPA. So thank you, Merritt, for hosting us. Sidewalk Labs is, I think, quite definitely an urban tech company. As you may know, we are an alphabet company, so we are, I like to say, you know, between us and Google, we make Alphabet billions of dollars. But really, we haven't gotten profitable yet, but we're only 18 months old. We started 18 months ago. Our mission is to merge the expertise, in fact, that Andrew touched on, of the technologist and the urbanist to improve cities. And our concern is that a lot of technology innovations are driven either from one of those two angles, but not the other. And we don't know that that's necessarily scalable, and if it's too much of a tech-driven product and doesn't get the nuance of how cities really work and what changes cities over the long term, it can have more negative consequences than positive consequences. So our ambition is to develop solutions that are broadly applicable and actually make cities more attractive on their own, and I would argue also in competition with the alternatives to cities, to suburbs, and to less dense arrangements for human activity that we know are less good for the planet than truly urban environments. We do that in a couple of ways. Our first real product that's out there through Intersection, a company we're the leading shareholder in, is, of course, the Link NYC. And we see it as the beginning of a product that could have global implications, but in fact also begins to deliver the digital realm in the urban public realm. Putting up advertising and offering free Wi-Fi really is only the very beginning of the capabilities of that set of ideas and interactions. And we see a lot of wonderful opportunities there. Of course, there are pitfalls. I'm sure all of you as New Yorkers know that the internet access we put on the street was used for somewhat less than noble purposes by a subsection of the population. To be entirely honest, I'm a little embarrassed. A bunch of us didn't see that coming. But nonetheless, I think it typifies the kind of problems that you can get into if you're overly optimistic about what technology does on the mean streets of the city. But at the same time, it's too easy to run away from the idea of putting stuff out there and trying it. And so I think that's the dialogue between the two. We've got a couple of other initiatives currently going on. One is around transportation information, and that to me has been a bit counterintuitive because our first product is intended to make parking easier. We're going to be surfacing parking availability information through wayfinding applications, which as a guy who tried to bring congestion pricing to Manhattan is a little bit odd. But nonetheless, we all know, of course, that the search for parking is a major contributor to unnecessary traffic, not so much, of course, in Midtown Manhattan, but in fact in many urban areas around the world. And so by making information available, you can actually address that. We're working in the provision of healthcare. We're working on how buildings are constructed. We're trying to figure out how to bring real data to the service of modeling land use and transportation planning, which remains in many ways stuck in the dark ages. And I'll come back to this, I think, later on in the conversation, but again, I think there's a tension between things that apply broadly to make life convenient and things that apply precisely to an urban environment that's characterized by density. And I think that's actually what we are aiming for, is how are we really thoughtful about those things that are specifically about making density work better and easier but don't necessarily have the equal enhancement to sprawl and other things that we don't want to enhance. Thank you.
Maria.
Hi, everybody. So aside from my small garden, what I spend my time doing is thinking about the urban environment, specifically New York City. So the Partnership Fund is money from the business community that is been put up not to make returns for the investors, but to invest in projects that make New York City a better place, help expand the economy, help low-income neighborhoods. So we in a targeted geographic area, focus on an unusual range of things, from how do you grow new technology sectors, which can include, and starting to include GovTech, civic tech kind of things, as well as thinking about how do you make sure that you're bringing job opportunities, services, et cetera, to low-income neighborhoods and underserved populations. And so my framing for this conversation is very much one as an investor, because the first half of my career I spent on Wall Street. So I call myself a fully recovered investment banker, but I do have that kind of in the background. And so the overlay that we look at everything is, at the end of the day, it's about money and how is it going to get funded. And so there are multiple funding sources. Government looks at funding it one way, the private sector another way. We're kind of in the middle, right? So we'll take more risk typically than a for-profit investor if we think there's a strong civic focus on it, but we don't give away free money, which is a position that government sometimes has to get things going. So when you look at things from the perspective of an investor, it sort of changes things a little bit, because you are much more conscious of, what are the revenue sources, what's the return on the money from a financial perspective, what are the barriers to getting something done, which in New York City in particular, there's a lot of these. And then I guess another kind of piece of what we're doing specifically is working in the financial technology and in the health tech world. And so when it comes to the topic we'll get into about data privacy, I know that the financial services sector and the healthcare sector get a lot of, there's a lot of talk about the disruption that's going to happen and all the new fintechs and digital health are going to come in and sort of with all these new business models. But there's some actually very interesting protections about consumer data that have been built in by government in the financial services sector. Something happened to the
There we go.
financial services and healthcare, which I think are worth talking about when we get to that section, because they were there specifically to do consumer protection. And then I guess as an investor, I would call it the blanket of reality when you're dealing in an urban environment, and particularly in thinking about how to interact with government or how government thinks about or partner with government around new technologies. You have issues around procurement. You have a unionized environment, which is particular in New York, and many times we've seen very interesting new technologies kind of run up against both of those factors. And then you have sort of who controls the data, how do you get access to the data, which in some parts of government is accessible, and they've done a better job, both city, state, and federal, at making data available, and in other cases it's not. And so you have some private sector companies addressing that, but that's another kind of theme, if you will, around the data accessibility when it comes to talking about GovTech and civic tech. And then I like to end with a specific example to give you the kind of the range of investments that we've made. We put money into the city bike share program, and our money went alongside a very complicated deal that had the government at the table, banks at the table, a marketing sponsor at the table, as well as Department of Transportation, many good things by the Bloomberg and now the de Blasio administration to get that done. And our money's being used to take that, though, to low-income neighborhoods to complement private capital. And then another one kind of on the other end about bringing technology into government-controlled areas is American Prison Data Systems, which provides a ruggedized tablet to deliver educational content to prisoners in prison. So you're bringing an outside technology company into a city and state, in some cases federally controlled environment. And so there's a whole host of issues that come up when you try to do that, because it's definitely the right thing to do, but there's a number of barriers around procurement, unionization, et cetera, which make investing from an investor's perspective in GovTech, civic tech, more complicated, I would say, than in straight up technology.
Thank you, Paul. So it's kind of a jump ball situation, so whoever feels like grabbing it, not everybody has to answer each question if they don't feel like it. I'd like to try to make this more of a conversation among the five of us if we could. The title of this panel is How Does Tech Enrich Public Policy? But from my experience in the last 5 or 10 years, I've noticed that most public policy people have a don't think of technology as enriching, but more of a big pain in the ass, because they're reacting to the speed at which the technology moves, the disruptive nature of the technology, new problems are as a result. I think many people didn't anticipate that the inventory of low-income and middle-income apartments would drop precipitously as a result of Airbnb when it first came on the scene, as an example. And so the question is why is it that public policymakers are reactive as opposed to proactive in trying to understand how these technologies are emerging and building frameworks or conversations in order to get to a meaningful result that provides potential economic development as a result of the technology, or a benefit to the city or to citizens as a result of the technology, and as least disruption as possible that doesn't cause these negative collateral effects. And just to add a little bit more context to that question, there's the other side of it, which is that some of these technologies are moving so fast that they are disrupting existing duopolies and monopolies, but they're creating new monopolies of their own. And what's the proper role of policymakers in order to rein in the creation of new monopolies and duopolies when the actual framework and the understanding of the technology as it proceeds is not well understood?
So, yeah, I'm going to jump for this ball.
All right, go for it.
So I think to answer the first part of the question, I use a sports analogy. And I think that government is the slow player on the field, on the soccer field. And so that we only get called onto the field because the rules of the game require that every team play every player. And so that's like a Little League reference or something like that, right? and so what I mean by that is I think the technologists are seeing their own pace, and they're afraid that that government involvement has the opportunity to help them lose the game, but probably doesn't help them win the game. But at some point, a lot of these technologies are introduced into the public realm. Autonomous vehicles, drones, the two references you made in the introduction, Airbnb, the reference made now. At some point, those things enter the public realm. And at that point, they're forced to put us on the field. And so it becomes this very reactive and in most recent cases, fairly combative, lawyered up type of situations. And I think this is just my personal perspective on it, is aside from the fact that, if we're being candid, a couple of the players are using it as part of their marketing strategy. But separate from that, it ends up that the technology, call it Uber or Airbnb, have built critical mass of demand on the public side. Haven't really engaged, I think, in a way with government to give an appropriate degree of consideration to the true public realm implications. And then government ends up in the corner, where Austin tries to ban Uber, and there's a big blowback because the public wants it, or they want something like it. Not considering the fact that there are some really legitimate concerns that need to be addressed by the government for the sake of its role. So my answer to that is that we need to find more meaningful, contributory ways for the government to be involved much earlier in the conversation. I also believe that in the DNA of engineers, they typically really enjoy solving problems. So I hold an optimistic view that if the government is involved earlier on, proves to the team that we're not the slow player on the field, but that we can actually contribute meaningful considerations or problems that need to be solved, those engineers will solve them earlier. So that when it is time to introduce that new technology, drones or autonomous vehicles or what have you, all parties are prepared, or at least better prepared. To your point about not seeing the internet use, there are going to be things that are not going to be seen, but there are plenty of them that we can foresee together and minimize that. I don't know if that's being entrepreneurial or that's an engineering approach to problem solving, but I think that has been both. That's my way of describing what I think has been the problem, and also a way to begin to solve that problem. The government needs to be prepared, I think, to take some measured risk in those early engagements and contribute in a meaningful way, present real problems, and when they're solved, then be willing to be prepared to accept the solution or begin to embrace the technology into the public realm.
Maria.
I'm going to disagree a little bit because it's a panel discussion, and if you agree, it's boring for the audience. So I guess I would divide tech and government into two different categories. There is the use of technology by government, which I would agree with you. It would be good if government were more active and a little bit faster on the field. But then there is what I call the referee role of government, where it's the private sector developing new technologies. And I would say you don't want the government in the field. What you want is government to create the framework, be the referee, set the rules, but then kind of get out of the way and let the private sector do what it does really well, which is come up with innovations. I think the problem is that it's a pacing thing, and so it's not, I would say, not government being on the field. It's government coming up as the referee to change the framework and change the rules when technology is advancing. And then I think on the other side, not to just blame it all on government, as the technology companies scale, because I think the whole idea of regulation, small companies pay no attention to it, and they figure, like, I'm not big enough for anybody to be bothered by me. It's only when they scale and things start to rise to the level of, like, a lot of people having a problem that government gets involved, that I think the feedback loop needs to be faster. But I think also, if you are disrupting as a big company a lot of things, be prepared to come to the table, because there's been a little bit of an arrogance of, like, you know what, we're breaking things, just get out of our way, it'll work itself out. And the answer is, I think, particularly in dense urban environments, things don't always work themselves out. You do need a referee to come to the table. I think if you live in an open area where there aren't many people, maybe things work themselves out better here. But in dense urban environments where every square inch, 5 people have an opinion about what should happen in that inch, which is what happens in New York City, you need the referees to come to the table. But I think as referees, to set and change the guidelines as opposed to an active participant on the field. So I would divide the two.
Go ahead, please.
I was just going to maybe offer a slight counterpoint, which I feel like government, in their ability to be on the field, is really the one pushing for some of the equity considerations that perhaps private business isn't always concerned with. Government has a responsibility to serve all of its citizens, and so they have to think about every single possible scenario of someone trying to use this technology and the fallout for different populations. And so I do think it's really important to have someone who has that perspective participating in that conversation.
And I think that the government as a player on the team, that to carry the analogy forward, is requiring that government act and perform differently. So that might be the delta between our thinking. It's not necessarily a disagreement. It's just a disagreement about the makeup of what the government player should act like and feel like. And the reason I say that is there's more than to expand on what I agree with you 100%. To expand on it, it's not just to set the guidelines or the rules or the regulations. There are real impacts on some that are made by some of these things that have a domino effect that the private sector, frankly, isn't. Just like we might not be built to innovate at the pace of private sector, the private sector isn't built to consider and address all those things. For example, autonomous vehicles, shared autonomous vehicles specifically, the value of the proximity of a parking space to a retail storefront is almost zero, because the car's going to come and drop you off. It doesn't need to park. It doesn't need to charge close to you. It doesn't need to do anything in any kind of physical proximity to you. So we could plant grass there, and there's a bunch of positives. But then what happens with the lost revenue? What happens when those autonomous vehicles don't commit moving violations anymore, and they're not writing traffic citations? And and that's just 2 layers on an onion that's going to generate a lot of tears. And so the point is,
Hopefully less people will die, Miguel, though.
Yeah, right. I mean,
yeah, there'll be some tears of joy for sure. But the point is that those are real impacts that have other effects, that the private sector on its own will develop the technology at breakneck speed and then be super frustrated to the point that it's on the front page of the media about why we can't just introduce this onto the streets of, for arm's length, San Francisco, because all these other things are going to happen. And what happens when those things have real world impacts on things that don't benefit the people who benefit from the autonomous vehicles? Like, this revenue goes to pay for other programs and do other things. And so my thesis is that if we present those problems that aren't technical or even specific to the technology in nature, those engineers will probably likely still help us solve for them, because they're required to be solved for in order for the technology in its aggregate to be successful, in my humble opinion.
Red, I want to give you a chance to speak, but I promise you the next question is actually going to go to you. So if you could I want to keep make sure we got a lot to cover, so please just make sure.
I acknowledge the oddness of being the only guy who works for a publicly traded corporation and saying one word we haven't used thus far in this conversation is greed. And I think we need to fess up to the fact that some of these companies have really not acted in the interests of the public, or even with the level of responsibility that companies traditionally have in places that make capitalism work well. Right? And I think that's something that, government, various political actors have called many of these companies out, and I think rightfully so. And I think it stems in part from arrogance, but I think we can't overlook that. I think another thing that we also can't forget is that it is a particularly American problem, this level of impoverishment of the government's ambition. If you look at Estonia, if you look at several European cities, I was yesterday in London and had a coffee with the Chief Technology Officer of Transport for London. They are doing really cutting-edge stuff, right? And so one of our challenges is that in the United States, and I don't mean this as anything about a specific administration or anything, this is actually a multi-generational problem we've got. Let's face it, the MTA is working hard so that 10 years from now it might implement a fare card technology that London and Hong Kong had 15 years ago. And that is a problem for us here in the United States. So we can't assume it's all government. I think it's one of our specific challenges. And then I think the final thing I'll point out is that most technology products are fundamentally originated with a consumer product mindset, right? And this is where I think it comes into conflict, Maria, as you pointed out, in terms of dense adoption, right? So those externalities, when you drive down the cost of something, when you make something radically easier, if the externalities remain the same, you inevitably increase the conflicts in a dense urban environment. And that's one of the deep-seated challenges, I think, for the technology industry.
Just 2 seconds, just to put a bow on it, because I think everything that's been described indicates, just to bring it full circle to this analogy, that it is a team effort, right? That there's value to be generated from the private sector, greed aside, and I thank you for saying it, but there's a lot of good that happens there, and the public sector's role in advocating for the interests of the whole community. And that's the point of all of us being on the field, contributing to all, and thinking about all these different factors and facets of this technology, its implications, its benefits, its detriments potentially, and all those sorts of things. That's ultimate. I'm not saying that government should field the whole squad or private sector. The point is, it's benefited from working
just
together.
to point out, the referees are on the field.
Yes, that's true.
But some of them don't understand the technology, which is a problem. Which now lets me bring it to the next point. Which, let me ask everybody in the audience: how many of you have read a terms of service all the way through before you clicked agree and downloaded that latest app? It's 4 hands, 5 hands. Okay.
I'm guessing they're in the law school.
They're in the law school. Okay, let me ask you another question. So 2 years ago, Congress voted after the Snowden episode to stop the NSA from collecting bulk data of all American citizens. How many of you believe that as a result of that vote, the NSA actually stopped collecting bulk data on American citizens? That's a very serious non-show of hands if you think about it, because we have a Congress, and we don't actually believe that Congress is actually enforcing its own laws. So the question I have is, whose responsibility is it to make sure that the public is engaged in debate regarding how the data collection is done, used, and, as is becoming more and more obvious, held in check? Because the Facebook knows more about us than any government entity. And maybe they're not responsible for our money yet, Miguel? But this stuff is moving really, really fast, and it seems like we love the apps, but we're not necessarily understanding the compromises we're making because of the efficiencies that are promised that, oh, you know, just as I finished my dinner, the car that I wanted just showed up, but I didn't even have to call Uber to get it. Just-in-time transportation, just-in-time, you name it. Where's the public policy framework need to go in order to make sure that we maintain human and civil liberties in the wake of the speed of this technology and privacy and security? Jump ball.
I'll say this will be super brief. I think it comes down to just recognizing, as I've already said, the difference between the entity. I think that really matters. It can't be set aside that Facebook knowing things about you is different than NSA knowing the very same things about you. Secondly, I think is choice. That it's different when people elect to give you information knowingly and perceive to receive some value in exchange for it, a la Facebook, or not in the NSA characterization. So I think my short thing for the group to maybe talk about is I think those are two really important components to the question that you pose.
So I think there is a role for consumer watchdogs, right? I mean, I think it's got to be a combination of pressure from consumer groups and people who, because if people are, as long as people are willing to give away their information and not paying attention to it, you know, I think at a certain point you are going to have consumers that are going to stand up and say, wait a second, this is not right. And you're starting to see some investigative journalists looking at this. You know, ProPublica looked at the algorithms that Facebook was using with respect to housing and found that they were violating the Fair Housing Act rules just by serving up based on your affinity group, which meant your race. So I think it speaks to the role of, you know, in their case, they're a nonprofit, but sort of private groups and people being willing to spend the time to investigate not just that they're collecting the data, but what are they doing with the data and how does it overlay against kind of the current set of protections that are out there. So my guess it's going to probably start there as opposed to government, and there will have to be enough of a ruckus raised or you'll have to tie it to an existing regulation for things to, for people to start to pay attention to it.
But Maria, I agree with you, but I want to give you another example where I think it's more challenging because I'm not going to name the company, but there is a company right now working for the Department of Homeland Security that's using AI and other predictive technology tools to identify where 11 million undocumented people in the United States are living and under whose roofs. And I wouldn't say the consumer groups are going to particularly know how to even call that out. It's more like a civil liberties issue than it is a consumer issue. And so just to reiterate the question, I think what I think is missing is that there's not a conversation happening among the public and public policymakers about these technologies. And in Sidewalk's case, which is why I wanted you to really speak about this a little bit, which is this trade-off, which is like if you provide the data, then you're going to have a more efficient and more happy life. But you should be able to control the limits of what, you know, the benefits are and know when you want it to stop. And it isn't clear, you know, by the way, not even mentioning DRM and the fact that these tech, you know, we don't actually own these things. They are owned, but we're borrowing them because we're not allowed to go inside and change it. So I'm just asking how do we get the public more engaged?
I mean, I think one of the realities that we have to face is that, as your question around the terms of service identifies, these are extraordinarily complex matters, and if you leave extraordinarily complex matters up to every individual, it becomes a problem. And at some point, mistakes are made. People don't understand the deal that they're making. We have a lot of consumer protections. We have those for a reason. We have HIPAA dealing with health data. We have that for a reason. It may well be that we are increasingly at that point where individual companies having terms of service on their own and allowing that to be a company to individual transaction has to have some sort of oversight. I say that because, in part, one of the things we're keenly aware of at Sidewalk Labs is that the future of urban technology depends on us tackling this issue, right? I mean, in fact, the promise of how cities could be operated better, how life could be made easier, et cetera, fundamentally depends on people having confidence that the data is being used in the ways that it is intended, right? What is often forgotten is that we throw off an incredible amount of data already, and we did as of 10 or 15 years ago, long before the cell phone or what have you. The amount of, we think about now all the tracking that goes on, but if you think about what AT&T knew about every single American for 50 years, because they knew every single phone call that had been made in the entire country, right? It's an immense amount of data, right? As soon as credit cards became prevalent, you could track not only spending patterns, times, locations, et cetera, right? MasterCard and Visa know incredible amounts about each of us, right? What happens is that there are standards. In AT&T's case, it was a monopoly, so there was a greater level of regulation. In consumer finance, you have certain standards. I think we're going to have to get there. What I don't think, though, has been fully integrated into this conversation is what actually should be private and where there are trade-offs in the public interest, where certain things we should stop considering private information. So, for example, right, under the terms of service, or not the terms of, but the privacy policy that Link NYC operates under, which is the city's privacy policy, right? A photo of me walking down Broadway in broad daylight, not covering my face, is personally identifiable information and therefore not acceptable to collect, right, and use. However, when I buy an apartment, the city of New York feels it completely within its right to publish not only the fact that the transaction took place, but my name, the name of the person I bought it from, the price paid, right? And the bank that issued the mortgage and the amount of the mortgage. And that's completely public information, and it's been that way for a century or so, right? We make that trade-off. All of us who have registered to vote, not only the fact that we've registered to vote and our address, but our party affiliation is a matter of public record, right? It's remarkable how invasive that is, right? We do it for reasons because the public is better served by the ability to monitor who's voting and who has the right to vote in a given primary, et cetera. So it's a trade-off. And I think one of the questions that we're all going to have to ask ourselves, and this will force, is what benefits do we want to acquire in exchange for giving up data? And I think a key question is there is a difference between data that is given away, used privately, right, as in the case that you identified in terms of working for the Department of Homeland Security, versus that is published and everybody understands that is just public information now. It's the basis for how we operate. It's a difficult thing, and it's not clear to me that when voter registration or property transactions were turned into public, that there was a fully informed debate. But I think those are questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves if we're going to realize the benefit of this.
Can I So we've been having a very sort of theoretical conversation about data and privacy, but I was hoping to maybe just talk a little bit about our work and how we collect data. So we work primarily with very low income tenants in traditionally underserved neighborhoods. We come to their home, we ask if we can install a sensor to monitor the temperature in their home. And we take it very seriously to talk to them about what the sensor will and won't do, what it can and can't do, what we're going to do with the data, how they'll have access to it, who else will have access to it. But the folks that we work with are not always particularly tech savvy. Some of them are very elderly and don't know how to use a smartphone, don't intend on checking their data. So I don't know that I really have an answer to this other than to say there are large swaths of the population who are not engaging in any of this conversation and are sort of just trusting, I would assume, that some benevolent person is going to do the right thing with their data because they don't have the skills or the digital literacy to really even be able to engage in that conversation. So I feel okay sleeping at night because we're a nonprofit. We're not trying to make a profit off of these people's data. And in fact, we are collecting this data to give back to them to try to help improve their living conditions. But I would feel very uncomfortable if I didn't understand how my data was being used, but I knew someone was trying to make a profit off of it.
Miguel, should the New York City Public Libraries or maybe the agencies of the City of New York be offering data classes to citizens, like encrypting their email and teaching them how to use Signal instead of regular text messaging?
Absolutely.
Let's start it.
I think it. The last part of this discussion alluded to that choice concept that I talked about, which is, are people electing to do it knowingly? Are they receiving value in exchange that they feel is commensurate or properly reciprocal to what they're giving up? Do they, to your point, do they even know what its real value is? Most don't. Even the tech savvy aren't necessarily data valuation experts. So even if they know what they're giving up and the kind of the tech component of it, they don't really know the value of it to the entity that is collecting it. Mm-hmm. And so there's definitely a lot more education, Andrew, for sure, the big piece to help people understand all of those ramifications and aspects, and also, you know, figuring out how to give people more choice and modernize. I mean, a lot of the building records or property records, as you pointed out, that conversation was probably a century ago. Times have changed, and so a lot of those things haven't been revisited in the modern era. So I think there's definitely a lot of discussion that has to happen.
Okay, so, you know, let's just stay a little bit longer on this, on the notion of efficiency and the idea that smart or urban technologies can in fact create better outcomes. We've been, you know, we see the ads by Siemens, we see the ads by IBM, we see the ads by big companies, we see the kiosks going up. But it doesn't, you know, New York is a city that was built, you know, and was most successful during the industrial age. It's almost, by its very nature, really hard to get it to convert itself into a 21st century city. It's not like, you know, if you wanted to build a 21st century transportation system in New York, you'd have to vacate the city for 5 years and rip out all the subways and, you know, and just even what we're facing with 14th Street and the L train is shocking in terms of how it will impact the city. So when's the tipping point? When do we actually feel like the promise of all of this technology to create a more efficient city actually become visible and real? Or is it just still theory?
I think it's going to happen in fits and starts, and I think it's going to happen in fits and starts. And you clearly need a force within government who makes the decision to say, for the delivery of certain services, and you can't tackle everything at once, but sort of pick off, prioritize, these are the areas where we want to deliver services, So under the Bloomberg administration, it was a huge lift, but they got City Bike done. And I would say that was a major transformation for both the city. It was a technology play, but it took probably 10 years to get that done from the beginning. Do I have that right? 10 years? About 10 years, right? To get City Bike?
Sometimes
Yeah.
it takes me 10 years to get the
Yeah.
bike out of the thing.
But leadership in terms of kind of a will to look to bring in new technology. I think there needs to be a discussion and a visitation of the procurement rules, because procurement rules are often the things that can get in the way of bringing new technology in, and that is a kind of a state-city issue in New York in terms of their ability to bring in new technologies. And I think you have to, as I remarked earlier, some of the technology you want to bring in, there's a unionized workforce that has to be brought to the table. So it's particularly in this environment, it's not easy, but I think it starts with the will at a macro level, and then there are pieces around the edges where I think individual companies can make a difference. It's just a very long sales cycle, and you need patient investors to make it happen.
I think one of the things that I'd like to point out is we can sometimes be too hard on when this future is going to arrive. For all its problems, Uber is a big force and has transformed particularly outer borough access to transportation, right? And Lyft and its competitors. That is a significant change. You go back a decade or so when 311 was an implementation of new technology, right? I mean, many, I don't know what the numbers are, you probably do, but the comparison of phone calls versus web hits on nyc.gov, right? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I don't know the number
But
off the top of my head.
it's pretty significant,
Yeah.
right? And so the availability of information, I think, from the government about the city has, maybe the interactive services have not kept up, but it is significantly better than it was. And again, I think if you look abroad to places where we have public institutions that are more aggressive, more better funded, right, and more able to act, and again, at the risk of harping on London, I mean, they are targeting service announcements based on where they have seen people's Oyster cards, and because they are linking cell phones and email addresses to Oyster cards, if you use a given station, it will decide when you need a service alert, right? And people love it, and the terms of service are there. I don't think anybody reads them either, but they trust this institution, right? And I think that makes all the difference.
Okay, if anybody has a question, we have a microphone standing here, so please come up and just get in the queue. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers as we get started. We already have a gentleman. So if you could, please, because we want to get as many in as possible, call the fire department, ask them to change the volume of their sirens. There we go. If you could, please.
Okay, good evening. I'm the former mayor of my city in Brazil, and there in Brazil we separate what is public service from what is a public interest service. A public service, we have to make a bid to concede for anyone to give this service for any company, and a public interest service is like the cab service that is have regulation, and on these kind of services, public interest services, I think is the technology is about to make the government deregulate this kind of services, because it was regulated because the government gave the certainty of safety on that service. The government evaluates the service, and with technology, the public can evaluate the service themselves. So that's about government, at least on these kind of services, gives to the public, to the citizens, the right to evaluate, and themselves, as Uber, as these kind of services, can be evaluated by the citizens, by themselves, and not anymore by the government. So this kind of deregulation has to happen too. I don't know if it's a question, but I would like to hear your comments about it.
So I guess on that, though, I would wonder, I mean, does the government, though, require the drivers to have insurance? Does the government require the certain safety levels? So I think you have that situation in New York, right, where there are certain baseline requirements that the government has for all drivers, including, people like. So it's not, you're not handing over, everything to the public, that the government's still in there making sure there's a baseline set of requirements.
I do think, though, it's. I mean, we can think about it as radical deregulation. I think, as you're pointing out, the better way to think about it is that particular government function has become obsolete, right? I mean, much like the licensing of, I don't know, chimney sweeps or wagon drivers or something, right? Becomes obsolete at a certain point. When the automobile takes over, all of a sudden people realize, oh, we ought to license drivers, right? Because that could kill somebody. So there's going to be a shift. And I think, government, to be smart, should be eager to see certain functions no longer necessary, right? I mean, oftentimes your best employee is working very hard to put himself out of a job, right? And in the same way, if government's really doing its job, it can achieve its same objectives without its active participation, as long as it's really achieving those same objectives in terms of certainty, in terms of equity, right? But I think, as our privacy conversation suggests, it's going to raise new questions. So if we think about it just as radical deregulation, that will miss part of the story and actually lead to the separation of the fight that says, well, hey, maybe we don't need fingerprinting of drivers, but maybe we do need to make sure that the street space is allocated better, right? I'm not sure.
Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Dean. I'm a senior fellow at NYU Law School. I raised my hand on reading the term of services. Not only do I teach law, but I teach privacy law. So I was very glad to see privacy issues surfaced by the panel, and I have two questions. The first is whether cities can and should play a leadership role on privacy. And they could do this in any of a number of ways. They could appoint a chief privacy officer in addition to a CTO. They could establish privacy principles. They could use their procurement power or data sharing agreements to impose a privacy framework on third parties. They could insist on certain privacy technologies as part of the technical solutions. So broad question about, is that an appropriate role for cities? And then second, I think the kind of 800-pound gorilla missing from this conversation is law enforcement. So all this data that's being collected under the heading of urban tech or civic tech, government tech, is like a rich source of new data for law enforcement to access that may or may not be appropriate, but what I'm really curious about is just how that's handled, how that's thought about inside the city. Does the police set its own policies? Do the policies come out of the civilian side? I don't know, are they imposed on the police? What does that intersection look like?
So this is where I get to play the rookie card a little bit, specific to New York, but I'll speak broadly to my experiences in other cities also. I think on the first topic, yes, privacy officers, or it's not so much about having a privacy officer and then having a false sense of accomplishment, but I think I would characterize it more as a intentional, concerted effort to address privacy concerns in the interest of guarding equity issues, civil liberty issues, those sorts of things that I think the government has a unique obligation to be concerned about. So I think that kind of boiling that back specifically to civic tech or gov tech, one of the things that we're thinking about in our approach to smart cities, just as a pointed example, and the IoT kind of landscape is how do we establish a platform that allows the city to implement and monitor not just privacy but security controls over that sort of infrastructure in a more structured way, letting us attempt anyway to avoid each silo having its own privacy definition and rule, but having some scalable way to I hesitate to use the word standardize because that's not really what I mean, but organize the way that those policies are applied to pieces of infrastructure or areas of the city that are in the jurisdiction of different departments. On the police issues specifically, I think it varies also by community. In some cases, it's the police commission seeking a lot of input from the public. Personally, I think that's a positive approach. Others, it's different, but I haven't learned enough yet about New York to comment on that specifically.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would say New York is also, like, in some ways, just by having an open data policy and our ability to look at how they present that data. I mean, I know for HeatSeek, we collect all this temperature data. It's tied to people's apartments. It's tied to their names and their addresses and their phone numbers. And so when we were thinking about, okay, if we're going to publish any of this publicly, how might we do that? My background is in sociology and public policy, not data or privacy or law. So we just looked at the open data and said, okay, when they post the 311 data, what personally identifying information do they put in and what did they leave out? And we saw that they did it by building level, but they didn't include individual apartments. So that's what we adopted. So I think there are already like a lot of ways where the city is taking the lead on at least setting an example.
Please.
Hi, I'm Rosmi. I'm a graduating senior here. I worked at Civic Hall 2 years ago with John,
looked
my curly-haired boss. Yeah. So I'm building an analytics tool for cities, like similar to Palantir, I guess, but not evil. I'm assuming Palantir is the company that's turning over all this immigration data. But anyway, none of us said it. So my question is this. If some city employee can use some analytics tool, for example, and see with a certain degree of statistical confidence which buildings are likely to violate heating code, for example, or which intersections a drunk driver might pass through, or which ones are dangerous for what reasons, how proactive can and should the government be with this information, with like such analytics tools? So could they like send a warning letter, for example, to some landlord, or should they repair the stuff themselves? So yeah, I guess there's this dichotomy between acting reactively and proactively, and what can and should the government do for these things?
I would say that it would be first to look at the allocation of resources of government, right? So that in the case of the buildings, rather than sending building inspectors out to all buildings on a certain schedule, you would focus on the ones that have the greatest, that have had the track record and the greatest prediction that they're going to be, running afoul of the laws. So I think that's where I would start. And then
Short of a Minority Report style feature, how far would you take it?
personally, I wouldn't take it as far as Minority Report.
Okay.
But I would use it to help government figure out how to use its resources. So I would start within the bounds of the law, which is landlords are required to have heat at a certain level. And so if there's a repeat offender, don't show up on a Thursday, show up Monday morning.
Mm-hmm.
I think also that the real power in this ability to collect data in mass isn't just to generate more work orders and chase more
It's to prevent them
thing.
from happening
It's-
in the first
It's
place.
to take the
Prioritize.
scale of the data collected and use it to identify in more predictive ways or in more efficient ways how to minimize those impacts, right? So it's not to say, oh, now we're just getting, in the past we got these complaints through 311, and so there was a throttle there that only so many people would bother to pick up the phone and call. And now a sensor telling us that there's a violation, if we just take that and generate the same ticket that was generated with a phone call, we've just generated more tickets. That then becomes a resource issue. But if we take that data and start understanding the reasons that this happened, and also in like your example about an intersection, if we understand not just which intersections are most dangerous, but why they're dangerous, and you find easier fixes that have bigger impacts, then you can make those prioritizations differently instead of just constantly chasing more work orders.
Mhm.
Because I think the problem, it's an interesting question, is if the predictive analytics, government takes that to go after an individual, I think that's a problem. If they take that information on a predictive basis, right? So to take the building, if my technology predicts that this landlord is going to violate the law, and I go in before they violate the law, like that to me is a problem. But if it allows government to say, you know what, in this area, there are consistent violations, so maybe I'll put an incentive program in place to try to incentivize people to do the right thing. That seems okay. Or I'm gonna put up and change the, as the city did, I'm gonna extend the sidewalk in certain areas and put up, boundaries. So I think it's a very fine line between government showing up before you've actually done something because they predict that you're gonna do it. I think that's where I would draw the line.
This is also happening with predictive policing, which is fraught with its own issues, but I
Okay.
digress.
Yeah.
So
Thank you for
we're
your-
really running out of time. So out of respect for the audience and for our panelists, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna ask each of you to ask your question short, just all to three, and then whichever one we can answer, we'll answer, and we'll just get you all in as quickly as possible. Just please ask your question, and let's move on.
So, considering the history of private institutions subverting public institutions, like in the case of Enron and the 2008 financial crisis, how do we move from a shareholder-centered design to a stakeholder-centered design? Thank you.
Thank you.
So the public often learns about the implications of data use and data collection through either investigative journalism or whistleblowers or academic researchers. And there's often like a scattered effort. Do you see room for like a more formal oversight authority? And if such an authority were to exist, would there be causes for concern?
Thank you. Last one.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So there's a broad range of you here that represent different parts of the ecosystem. Noel, you represent an organization that's actively trying to augment policy. Rohit, you represent one that's working hopefully within policy. And then there's obviously ones that actively fight policy. So how do we encourage the ecosystem to generate more organizations that may not have as much funding or economic incentive to augment policy? And whose role is that within the ecosystem that we see here? So thank you very much.
Thank you. So anybody can answer any of those three that they feel.
I can
Compelled.
start with that first one and just say that's a fantastic question. Yeah, I think it kind of gets back to what we've sort of been dancing around this whole time, which is it's maybe less on like the straight up greed side, but more if you're building a business that has a profit motive and that's what's driving your decision making, you end up with a product that is profitable, right? We did not start HeatSeek that way. We started HeatSeek with the understanding that we wanted to solve a particular problem, and then we built a product, and it's turning into a suite of products to solve that particular problem. Where that gets tricky is, as a nonprofit, we don't have equity, so we can't go out and get private investment or like venture funding. But as a nonprofit, foundations are really not used to, most of them, not used to thinking about funding technology that amplifies public policy or provides new tools to the very people that those policymakers are already paying to protect some of our most vulnerable tenants. So we exist in this sort of middle ground that I think is there. We're adding to the players who are willing to fund that kind of thing, but yeah, you're not going to see a lot more of this until there's some way of funding it.
So there's I'm going to combine 2 and 3, I think. So in the last, 5 years, there's a movement, the B Corp movement, which is explicitly targeted at, it's a new legal structure which allows a company to take into consideration the broader stakeholders. So there's now a legal construct which allows companies to be in that middle area between kind of for-profit and nonprofit, and still be able to get equity in your company. And I guess I would say, as somebody who is actively looking for social businesses to invest in, there is way more money looking to invest in a social business than there are good entrepreneurs. Now, when I say a social business, it's one that doesn't require full grant funding, but where there's a revenue associated with it. So I would say to the person who asked that question is find a problem and go start an interesting B Corp that's addressing that problem.
I'd like to pick up on Maria's point, and as somebody who also spent time in the nonprofit sector as a grant maker at a foundation, I certainly think nonprofits have a phenomenal place in the world, but I think the scalability of nonprofits is fundamentally a problem, right? And as much as I had negative things to say about greed earlier, it is a wonderful tool that drives things forward, and we have created a great economy most of the time by harnessing it, right? But the harnessing of the capitalist motive, other than specific circumstances where people are willing to give up their profits or restrict their profits voluntarily, depends fundamentally on really good regulatory structures and legal regimes. And our fundamental challenge is actually that those regimes keep up, be willing to get rid of their old ideas when those become obsolete is one of the questions identified, but then also take on the new ones aggressively. And I think to the point that a couple of you have made, it is the challenge of our times is how does government get ahead of technology before you have as many entrenched interests on the new stuff as you did on the old stuff, and you wind up just having a warped system in a different direction.
I think, Miguel, you want to just
I
last
think
word
just
from
one-
last word from the government or Big Brother, one or the other.
I think something that just keeps coming to mind as the discussion has been occurring is the government is in service of the people, and the people make their choices clear when they vote, in theory. And that's a whole different conversation. So my point is that we're talking about needing to modernize government and government needing to look and act differently, and the interaction and the partnership with the private sector and the nonprofits and this whole, we're talking about a lot of these things, and I guess my question is, do people say that in rooms like this, or do they say that publicly? And do they say that to themselves when they're voting, and do they say that to their elected officials that they want the government to be better prepared to participate in these conversations and to be a bit more entrepreneurial perhaps and to be more in front of some of these things? I'm not sure if the public is, so it's my way of putting it kind of back on you, is the public informed and active as it should or could be to help push some of these things forward?
But do they really need to be that informed on the tech side of things if they are informed on, I want to have heat in my apartment and I want to know that it's going to work? Like, do I need to get involved necessarily in this tech conversation?
No, I think we're talking about two different things. I'm not saying they have to be informed on the technology. In fact, what I was just talking about had very little to do with technology other than the government being advanced enough to participate in a meaningful way in the conversation. But the point is, are we asking the right questions or having the right expectations of government as the public?
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end here at SEPA, at a public policy school. Is this on? Everyone can hear me? I just want to really thank our amazing panelists. This is the kind of conversation that we're so fortunate to be able to have here at SEPA. And I hope all of you are inspired as we think about the next generation of public sector leaders who are really grappling with these questions. So I want to give a really big thank you to our amazing panelists and our amazing moderator. And I want to thank the Dean for her visionary leadership at this area to really put SEPA at the forefront of innovation, entrepreneurship, and public policy. And thank you so much for coming out tonight. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.